Picture a Tuesday morning somewhere in the quieter part of Tennessee. No stage lights, no crowd of thousands filling the seats, just a man sitting across from people who have known him for the better part of 3 decades. Speaking slowly the way a person speaks when they have carried something long enough and finally decided the time has come to set it down out loud. Guy Penrod turned 61 this year, and the silver in his hair and the lines in his face belong to a life that has been genuinely fully lived. 10 children, 30 years of gospel music, and a faith that has been tested in places most audiences never see from where they sit. On that particular morning, in that particular room, he said something that nobody present has been able to fully move past since. What makes it so heavy is what was not. No breakdown, no formal press release, no carefully worded announcement designed to soften the landing for the public. Guy Penrod, the same man he has always been, simply told the truth in a room where truth was the only thing it ever known how to offer. And what he said was that the chapter of his life his fans have known and loved may be drawing to a close. The people gathered around him had watched this man pour himself out night after night across arenas, auditoriums, and church sanctuaries from one end of the country to the other. When he finished speaking, the room held a kind of silence that rooms rarely hold anymore, and the people in it were left sitting with something they had not walked in expecting to carry. Stay with us through this entire video because the full weight of what Guy Penrod said and what it means not just for him personally, but for the Southern gospel music world he helped define deserves the time and care we're going to give it here. The part of this story that most people have been talking around without ever quite saying directly comes at the 10-minute mark, and we are going to say it plainly. For anyone who found this video through a recommendation or who is coming to Guy Penrod's story fresh, understanding why this moment carries the weight it does starts with understanding who this man is and what he has meant to the Gaither Vocal Band and the broader Christian music community. Joining the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994 at 30 years old, Guy Penrod arrived from Abilene, Texas, carrying a voice that sounded like it belonged to a different era, warm and full and unmistakably rooted in the Southern gospel tradition, with the kind of power you register in your chest before your mind catches up to what it's hearing. Bill Gaither has spent his entire career working alongside some of the most gifted voices in gospel music history. And the man does not reach for superlatives easily, but the words Bill chooses when talking about Guy are noticeably different from the ones he uses for almost anyone else. What Guy Penrod became across those years with the Gaither Vocal Band and the Homecoming video series was something specific and rare. The singer who turned a performance into a moment, standing at center stage during a homecoming concert or seated in that legendary circle of gospel artists during a videotaping. Guy carried the ability to make every person in a room of thousands feel that the song was aimed directly at them, not performed at them, but genuinely delivered to them one person at a time. Certain performances live in the memory of homecoming fans, the way Scripture does, recalled by heart. No need to look them up. His recording of Redeemed, the authority he brought to there as a river, the way Glorious Open Up when he carried it through his solo years. None of those were simply good performances. People reached for them in hard seasons, in the quiet hours after a loss, in the long stretches of doubt when the faith felt distant, because something in the way Guy sang made the invisible feel present and real. For the millions of fans who discovered the Guy homecoming videos through a church library or a family member's shelf or late-night television, Guy Penrod was not just a singer on a screen. He became part of the soundtrack of their faith, and that is the reason what is now said lands the way it does. Getting to where Guy Penrod stands at 61 requires going back not just to the career, but to the man running underneath it the entire time. Guy and his wife Angie have raised 10 children together, and that number is not a footnote in his story, but the load-bearing fact of who he is. From the earliest days of his time with the Guy Vocal Band, family was a subject he returned to with more energy than any other. The thing that lit him up in interviews when he could have been talking about platinum records or sold-out concerts. Other artists in the homecoming world spoke about their music and their ministry, and Guy spoke about those things too. But he always came back to Angie, to the kids, to the life they were building in Tennessee with a kind of deliberate intention that some people admire and others find quietly convicting. 14 years into his tenure with the Gaither Vocal Band, 2008 arrived and Guy stepped away from the group. The reason he gave was the straightforward kind. His family needed him present in a way the demands of touring at that level could not accommodate, and the kind of father and husband he wanted to be was incompatible with what that schedule required. Some fans were devastated. Others understood it immediately. Even those who mourned the departure recognized something coherent about a man who had been singing about the sanctity of family, choosing to live that conviction when it cost him something real. The solo career that followed was not a quiet retreat. His self-titled debut in 2009 went gold. He toured broadly, and his returns to the homecoming stage as a featured guest drew the kind of response that made clear the affection had not thinned at all during his absence. None of it looked like a man who had run out of things to give. But people who watched closely during those solo years noticed something that the headlines never captured. Certain interviews held pauses that lingered a beat too long. Moments where a straightforward question seemed to land somewhere deeper than the surface answer being given. Something was being carried that was not being named yet. Those who had followed his ministry through the decades could see it, even if they could not identify it precisely. And now at 61, what was running beneath the surface for all that time has come fully into the open. What Guy Penrod said in that room, and what the people closest to him have since confirmed separately, is the part of the story that most of gospel media has moved past without stopping to examine. And we are going to give it the attention it deserves. The conversation has been moving quietly through gospel music circles, started away conversations that actually matter tend to start not in front of a large audience, not with cameras running, but in a smaller room where Guy Penrod spoke with the kind of candor that has always been one of his most disarming qualities. What he addressed was a question he had clearly been sitting with for some time, and the word that kept surfacing was sustainability, not financial sustainability, not career sustainability in conventional sense, but the deeper and more demanding question of whether the version of his ministry that fans have known was one he could continue in good conscience. And this is where the story turns in a direction nobody in his immediate circle expected, at least not framed the way it has now emerged. Guy Penrod has spoken openly about what 30 years of performing has done to his voice and his body, and the words he used carried a weight that people in the room felt physically. The kind of singing that made him a defining figure in Southern gospel music, full-throated, held back by nothing. Every performance given everything is not something the human instrument sustains without consequence across 3 decades. And there have been seasons of careful vocal management, decisions made backstage that never reach the audience. The invisible labor that professional singers carry while the people in the seats see only the result. But the physical dimension is only part of what Guy named. Running alongside it, and arguably deeper than has been a spiritual and emotional reckoning of the kind that comes to people of genuine faith when they have given a very large portion of themselves to a very public calling and begin asking honestly what they have left to give, and to whom and for how long that giving is what they are called to do. The specific words Guy used, and this is the part that landed hardest on the people who heard them express a belief that he may be living inside the final chapter of his active ministry. Fans have known it. Not the end of his faith, not the end of his love for gospel music and the Christian music tradition he has spent his life inside, but the end of Guy Penrod as a performing artist in the full sense of what that identity has required. He did not say this for attention, and anyone who has watched him long enough to know the difference between performed vulnerability and the real kind could see that immediately. He said it because it was true, and because the man who has always returned to honesty, even when honesty came a price, had arrived at a moment where honesty required saying something that would be painful for a great many people to receive. The gospel community responded the way a family responds. Grief came first, and alongside it something that looked like gratitude, and from people like Bill Gaither, who has known Guy Penrod for 30 years, now longer than most of Guy's children have been alive. A quiet acceptance settled in the kind that belongs to people who had perhaps seen this moment coming before it was spoken aloud. Bill Gaither has returned across years of interviews and conversations to one quality above all others when describing what he looks for in artists who join his ministry. Real people living a real faith rather than performing one for an audience. What Guy Penrod is doing right now, as hard as it is for the fans of the Gaither Vocal Band and the homecoming tradition to receive, may be the most authentic himself he has ever been in public. None of that, though, makes it easy to name what this actually costs. Not the fans, Guy himself. 30 years of watching people weep and find their way back to God in the middle of the song you are singing. 30 years of that intimacy with what your voice can do for a person in their hardest season, and then choosing in faithfulness to lay it down. That is its own category of grief, specific and serious, and not to be waved away with reassurances. People who have been in the room with Guy recently described someone at peace, not resigned, not defeated, but carrying particular peace that arrives after a long and honest conversation with God about what comes next. For the people who have followed Guy Penrod's journey across the homecoming era, across the solo recordings, across the moments when his voice caught something that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond the room he was standing in, this moment asks something from us in return. Two things have to be held at once, and neither one cancels the other. The grief of what may be ending is real and should not be rushed past. So is the respect owed to a man who is choosing honesty and faithfulness over the considerably easier path of continuing, because his audience wants him to. Gospel music, like all music now, runs increasingly on platform metrics and brand management and the machinery of visibility. And inside all that machinery, there is something genuinely countercultural about a man who says clearly that he's given what he has, and that what remains he wants to give to the people he loves most and to God in a quieter register. That is not failure dressed up in spiritual language. That is not a tragedy. Even though it may arrive feeling like one, what this moment reveals about Guy Penrod is the same thing as music revealed for 30 years running, that he means what he sings. The faith has never been a costume worn for the stage. When the song spoke about surrender and about laying things down and about the peace that passes understanding, those words were coming from somewhere real. And they are coming from somewhere real now in the hardest application of everything they promised. For the fans who were there from the early homecoming days, who could slide a VHS tape into the player on a Sunday afternoon and find themselves in a room full of believers they had never met somehow already knew. You understand precisely what it means when we say that some voices become part of the architecture of a person's faith. Guy Penrod's voice belongs in that category, and honoring that means sitting with this moment rather than moving past it too quickly. What does it mean to you personally to receive this news as someone who has carried his music through the years? Leave your thoughts below, because in a community like this one, the reflections of the people who actually lived through these decades of Gaither Vocal Band history and Southern gospel music matter in ways that go beyond the comment section. One more part of the story has gone largely unconnected, and it reframes everything that came before it. Guy Penrod did not arrive at this moment alone, and understanding the full shape of it requires understanding something about the longer arc of the Gaither Vocal Band itself, and what it has meant to the men who built their lives inside it. The group that produced the homecoming recordings that assembled legends in a room and pointed cameras at them, and let the music happen, operated the way a commercial band operates. What Bill Gaither built was closer to a fellowship. Men gathered around a shared faith and given through his vision an extraordinary opportunity to make art that mattered and to do it alongside each other over decades. Several of those men have arrived at their own moments of reckoning, each shaped differently. Michael English's journey through struggle and restoration has been documented publicly, and the way homecoming fans receive his comeback carried the specific grace that belongs to a community built on a theology of redemption. Russ Taff, whose voice stands among the singular instruments in all of Christian music history, has spoken with a vulnerability that surprised even people who knew him about the battles running beneath the surface of a celebrated career. Mark Lowry, who reaches for human the way other people reach for armor, has in his more unguarded moments reflected honestly on what it means to give in so much of yourself to a calling across so many years. The thread connecting these men to Guy, and connecting all of them to each other, is that none of them were simply performers. They were witnesses. Night after night, they stood before audiences and testified in music to something they believed with the full weight of their actual lives. And that kind of ministry sustained across decades changes a person in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but are always real. It asks everything, and eventually everything gets asked. Bill Gaither, the man who created the world that made all of their ministries possible, has returned consistently to a single phrase when talking about what he hopes for every artist who has passed through that fellowship. Finish well, not perform, not stay visible, not protect the brand. Finish well. Whatever Guy Penrod's next chapter holds,